There is a quiet house in Tennessee that most people would pass without a second glance. No gates, no flashing signs, no reminders of greatness. Yet inside those walls, one of the most influential voices in American music took his final breath. Bobby Blue Bland, the man whose voice blended velvet smoothness with aching fire, spent his last days far from the stage, far from the spotlight, and far from the world he helped shape. To understand how Bobby Bland became a king of the blues, you have to begin far away from fame, in a place where survival mattered more than dreams. He was born Robert Calvin Brooks on January 27, 1930, in the small rural town of Rosemark, Tennessee. His biological father left early, and Bobby grew up without him. When his mother remarried, her new husband Leroy Bridgeforth became the man Bobby knew as a father, and from him came the name Bland. A name that would one day echo across generations of music lovers. Bobby's childhood was shaped by hardship. He left school in the 3rd grade and never returned, trading classrooms for long days in cotton fields. Reading and writing were luxuries he never gained, but what he lacked in formal education, he made up for with instinct, memory, and an extraordinary ear for music. Songs stuck with him effortlessly. Melodies lived inside him long after others forgot them. Music first found Bobby on street corners. Encouraged by a local musician, he sang for spare change, often performing country and hillbilly songs he learned by listening to the Grand Ole Opry. Anything was better than a lifetime bent over cotton rows. His mother saw the same thing he felt, that Rosemark was too small for a boy with that voice. When Bobby was still a teenager, they made a life-changing move to Memphis. At the time, Memphis was the heartbeat of Black American music, a city where gospel, blues, and soul collided in ways that could change a life overnight. Bobby worked wherever he could to survive. He washed dishes, delivered groceries, learned basic auto mechanics, and eventually earned a driver's license, a small detail that would quietly open doors he never expected. By day, he worked. By night, he followed sound. Beale Street pulled him in with its glow, its clubs, and its promise. Unlike many young singers chasing raw, gritty blues, Bobby gravitated towards something smoother. He admired elegance. His heroes were artists like Nat King Cole, Charles Brown, T-Bone Walker, Amos Milburn, and Jimmy Witherspoon. He wasn't interested in shouting the blues. He wanted to confess them. On Beale Street, Bobby fell into a loose circle of young musicians who would later become legends themselves. B.B. King, Johnny Ace, Roscoe Gordon, and others formed a community that supported one another, shared stages, and traded lessons late into the night. Bobby idolized B.B. King, not as a rival, but as a guide. Contrary to later myths, Bobby wasn't a servant or subordinate. He simply did whatever he could to learn. Driving, carrying equipment, standing nearby, absorbing everything. At first, Bobby struggled. His timing wasn't perfect. He leaned too heavily on falsetto and imitation, but he refused to quit. One of his bravest moves was stepping onto the stage at amateur night at the Palace Theater, a place notorious for humiliating performers who weren't ready. Winners earned only $1, but Bobby wasn't chasing money. He wanted to be seen. He won enough times to get noticed. That attention led to his earliest recording attempts around 1950 and 1951 with small labels. The sessions were rushed, often recorded at the end of someone else's studio time, and they went nowhere commercially. But someone important was watching. Duke Records took notice, and Bobby signed his first real recording contract. He couldn't read it. He trusted the people guiding his hand. Just as momentum began to build, his journey stalled again. Bobby was drafted into the U.S. Army. Even there, music followed him. He joined a military entertainment unit, performing for troops and singing songs by artists whose polish and emotional restraint shaped his future sound. These years quietly transformed him. When he returned to civilian life, he wasn't just a singer anymore. He was becoming an artist with direction. Back in Memphis, Bobby joined Junior Parker's band, the Blue Flames. At first, he was support, driving, setting up equipment, opening shows, but the exposure mattered. Touring the Chitlin Circuit hardened him. Night after night, town after town, Bobby learned discipline, stamina, and emotional control. By the late 1950s, he was ready to step forward on his own. That was when everything changed. Bobby abandoned imitation and discovered something uniquely his, a controlled emotional cry known as the squall. It wasn't shouting, it wasn't begging, it was pain shaped with elegance. Around this time, he began working closely with bandleader and arranger Joe Scott, the man who would define his sound. Together, they built a style that fused blues emotion with jazz-influenced horns and precise arrangements. Bobby didn't play instruments. His voice was the instrument, and Joe Scott taught him how to wield it perfectly. By the end of the 1950s, Bobby Blue Bland was no longer chasing success. He was becoming inevitable. By the mid-1950s, Bobby Blue Bland's life finally began to move forward, but not without cost. After returning from military service in 1954, he stepped back into a music scene that had already shifted. Some of his Beale Street peers were rising fast, others had fallen away, and Bland found himself needing to re-establish his place. He joined Junior Parker's traveling review, not as a star, but as a helper. Driving, carrying equipment, opening shows, and learning the realities of life on the Chitlin Circuit. It was humbling work, but it placed him exactly where he needed to be, on the road, in front of real audiences, night after night. This period shaped Bland more than any recording session ever could. Performing in small theaters, juke joints, and packed southern venues taught him discipline and restraint. Unlike many singers who relied on raw power, Bland learned that control was everything. He studied how crowds reacted, when to pull back, when to lean into emotion, and how silence could be just as powerful as sound. His voice grew richer, calmer, more intentional. At the same time, his relationship with Duke Records deepened under the control of Don Roby, a powerful and controversial figure in black music. Roby recognized Bland's potential immediately, but the business relationship was deeply unequal. Unable to read or write, Bland signed contracts he did not fully understand. Contracts that paid him far less than industry standards and transferred publishing rights away from him. Still, Bland remained loyal. Roby provided stability, studio time, promotion, and structure, things Bland had never known growing up. For a man who lacked formal education and a strong father figure, that structure mattered, even if it came at a financial cost. Musically, everything changed when band leader and arranger Joe Scott entered the picture. Scott became the architect of Bobby Bland's sound. He fused big band jazz horns with blues phrasing, creating arrangements that felt cinematic, elegant, and emotionally restrained. Scott demanded precision. Every note, every pause, every breath mattered. Bland absorbed those lessons completely. This partnership helped Bland abandon the falsetto style he once leaned on and develop the vocal approach that would define his career. He introduced what he later called the squall, a controlled, emotional cry inspired partly by gospel preaching, particularly the sermons of Reverend C.L. Franklin. But unlike raw blues shouting, Bland's squall was measured. It rose gently, cracked just enough, then resolved with dignity. It made pain sound graceful. By the late 1950s, the results were undeniable. Bland began releasing a steady stream of hits that resonated deeply with listeners. Farther, On Up the Road opened the door, followed by classics like It's My Life, Baby, Little Boy Blue, Cry, 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 and I Pity the Fool. These songs didn't rely on flash or trend. They spoke directly to heartbreak, endurance, regret, and longing, emotions his audience understood intimately. Throughout the 1960s, Bobby Blue Bland quietly became one of the most successful R&B artists in America. He placed dozens of songs on the charts, including multiple #1 R&B hits and several major crossover successes. Yet, unlike Motown stars or pop-oriented soul singers, Bland remained slightly outside the mainstream spotlight. His label focused on a mature black audience, particularly women, and that audience remained fiercely loyal. Bland never needed spectacle. He stood still on stage, holding the microphone, letting the horns swell behind him while his voice carried the weight. He didn't play instruments. He didn't dance. His power came from control and emotional truth. Night after night, he delivered performances that felt personal, almost private, even in crowded rooms. Behind the scenes, his life was demanding but stable. He toured relentlessly, sometimes performing hundreds of shows a year. The road was exhausting, but it kept him connected to the people who loved his music most. Unlike many artists, he never abandoned the small venues or regional circuits that built his career. By the end of the 1960s, Bobby Blue Bland was no longer just a singer chasing success. He had become a standard. Younger artists studied him, peers respected him, and audiences trusted him. His voice didn't chase trends. It set a mood, one that would outlast entire eras of popular music. What few people realized at the time was that this era of disciplined elegance, stability, and success was only the middle chapter of a much longer story, one that would test Bland's adaptability, challenge his legacy, and ultimately reveal the quiet strength that defined him far beyond the charts. By the late 1950s, Bobby Blue Bland was no longer just another promising voice drifting through the Memphis and Houston circuit. He was becoming a force. The years between roughly 1957 and the late 1960s would define not only his career, but the emotional language of modern blues and soul itself. This was the period when everything aligned. The voice, the material, the band, and the discipline behind the scenes that turned raw talent into timeless artistry. The breakthrough came in 1957 with Farther On Up the Road. It wasn't a flashy record, but it carried something deeper: authority. Bland didn't sound like a man trying to impress. He sounded like a man who knew. The record climbed the R&B charts and announced that a new kind of blues singer had arrived. From that moment forward, his releases were no longer experiments. They were statements. What followed was one of the most remarkable runs in American music. Over the next decade, Bobby Bland became one of the most consistent hitmakers in R&B, quietly stacking chart success without ever relying on pop gimmicks. Songs like Little Boy Blue, Cry, 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 I Pity the Fool, That's the Way Love Is, Call on Me, and Ain't Nothing You Can Do weren't just popular. They were emotionally precise. Bland delivered heartbreak without melodrama, confidence without arrogance, and vulnerability without weakness. A major reason for this consistency was his partnership with band leader and arranger Joe Scott. Bland would later say flatly that no one influenced him more. Scott didn't just arrange music, he engineered emotion. He built a sound that fused blues guitar with bold, disciplined horn sections inspired by big band jazz, creating something that felt elegant yet deeply rooted in Black Southern tradition. Under Scott's direction, Bland learned control. Every note had purpose. Every pause mattered. Scott drilled him relentlessly on diction, phrasing, and timing, teaching him how to use restraint as power. Bland stopped chasing notes and began inhabiting them. This was when he perfected what became known as the squall, a controlled gospel-inspired cry that rose at just the right moment, not as excess, but as release. This technique wasn't about volume. It was about tension. Bland would hold back emotion, letting the listener lean in, and then unleash just enough to crack the heart open. It was a vocal strategy borrowed partly from gospel preaching, partly from jazz crooners, and refined into something entirely his own. It became his signature, instantly recognizable and impossible to imitate without sounding false. Unlike many of his peers, Bland never played an instrument. His voice was the instrument, and he treated it with the same discipline a master musician would treat a Stradivarius. He rehearsed obsessively. He studied lyrics until he understood not just the words, but the psychology behind them. When he stepped to the microphone, nothing was accidental. The albums from this era are now considered cornerstones of blues and soul. Two Steps from the Blues, 1961. Here's the Man, 1962. Call on Me, 1963. The Soul of the Man, 1966. And Touch of the Blues, 1967, remain essential listening. What made these records special wasn't just Bland's voice, but the way everything worked together. Horns swelling without overpowering, guitars cutting cleanly through the mix, and arrangements that gave Bland space to tell the story. Commercially, the success was undeniable. Bobby Bland became one of the most charted R&B artists of the 1960s, ranking near the top in total entries. Several of his singles crossed over to the pop charts, an uncommon achievement for a blues singer at the time. Yet, despite this success, Bland was never marketed as a mainstream pop idol. His label understood his audience: mature, loyal, emotionally engaged listeners, especially women, who connected deeply with his restraint and sincerity. Touring was relentless. At his peak, Bland performed hundreds of shows a year, moving non-stop through the Chitlin Circuit and beyond. He played theaters, ballrooms, juke joints, and festivals, often performing night after night with little rest. The schedule was brutal, but it forged an unbreakable bond between him and his audience. Bland didn't just sing to people, he sang with them, sharing their stories back in melody and verse. In 1973, Duke Records was sold to MCA, closing the chapter on the era that had defined Bland's artistic identity. Some critics rushed to say his best days were behind him, that the magic was tied to a specific sound, a specific time. But Bobby Bland had never been a man frozen in one moment. He adapted without abandoning himself. The MCA years brought a more polished, West Coast production style that divided some longtime fans, but it also introduced Bland to new audiences. Songs like This Time I'm Gone for Good and I Wouldn't Treat a Dog the Way You Treated Me proved that his voice still carried authority no matter the setting. His emotional intelligence remained intact, and his storytelling only deepened with age. Perhaps most symbolically, Bland reunited with B.B. King, the friend he had once followed as a young hopeful on Beale Street. Together, they recorded and performed as equals, closing a circle that had begun decades earlier. Their collaborations weren't about nostalgia, they were about mutual respect, two masters acknowledging the road they had walked together. By the end of this period, one thing was clear. Bobby Blue Bland had already secured his place in history. Not through spectacle, not through controversy, but through consistency, discipline, and emotional truth. He had reshaped the blues into something smoother, more introspective, and deeply human. Music that didn't shout to be heard because it didn't have to. And yet, his story was far from over. The later chapters would reveal a quieter strength, a different kind of legacy, and a man who, after decades of carrying other people's emotions, began to turn inward, toward home, reflection, and a life lived with dignity beyond the spotlight. By the time Bobby Blue Bland entered the final chapter of his life, he had nothing left to prove. His voice had already shaped modern blues and soul. His phrasing had influenced generations of singers who never quite realized where their instincts came from. And his name, even when spoken quietly, carried weight among musicians who understood what real mastery sounded like. In the later years, Bland chose distance over noise. He no longer chased charts, trends, or constant touring schedules. Instead, he focused on balance, selective performances, meaningful studio work, and time spent away from the stage. While many legends struggle with fading relevance, Bland never did. His audience aged with him, stayed loyal, and continued to show up wherever he sang. His final long-term recording home, Malaco Records in Jackson, Mississippi, gave him something he hadn't felt in years: stability. The label respected his artistry and understood his audience. There was no pressure to reinvent himself or dilute his sound. At Malaco, Bobby Bland simply was Bobby Bland. Over nearly 2 decades, he recorded more than a dozen albums there, earning 7 Grammy nominations during that period alone, a rare achievement for an artist so deep into his career. Albums like Midnight Run proved that his voice still carried authority. It wasn't about vocal acrobatics or modern polish. It was about control, emotion, and lived experience. His delivery grew slower, heavier, and more reflective, but never weaker. If anything, age gave his voice gravity. Every word felt earned. Offstage, Bland lived a life that surprised many people who expected excess. His home in Germantown, Tennessee, just outside Memphis, was modest and calm. No massive estate, no flashy displays of wealth. Just a single-story house filled with family photos, familiar furniture, and the quiet comfort of routine. He preferred early mornings, gospel records, Nat King Cole, and sitting on his porch listening to the world pass by. Friends described him as gentle, thoughtful, and private. The same man who commanded stages with confidence now moved through life at an unhurried pace. He rarely traveled unless the performance truly mattered. Fame had given him everything it could. Peace was what he valued most. In his final years, Bland's health slowly declined. Congestive heart failure limited his energy, but not his dignity. He remained sharp, reflective, and deeply aware of the life he had lived. When asked how he wanted to be remembered, his answer was never grand or dramatic. He said he hoped people would see him as a good old country boy who tried to give people something to listen to, something that helped them through hard times and good times. On June 23rd, 2013, Bobby Blue Bland passed away quietly at the age of 83. There were no headlines screaming scandal, no controversy clouding his name, just the closing of a chapter that had been written with discipline, sacrifice, and rare artistic integrity. His death marked the loss of one of the last true bridges between gospel, blues, soul, and modern R&B. A singer who didn't chase attention, he commanded respect. A man whose influence ran deeper than charts, deeper than trends, and deeper than most listeners ever realized. Bobby Blue Bland didn't just sing the blues, he refined them, softened them, and made them intimate. He proved that strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers and still changes everything. If you found value in Bobby Blue Bland's story, take a moment to like this video. It helps more people discover these hidden legacies. Subscribe for more deep dive stories about music icons who shaped history behind the scenes, and share this video with someone who truly appreciates real soul, man. And let us know in the comments, where does Bobby Blue Bland rank among the greatest voices of all time?